Well, welcome everyone. It's noon, strike of the hour, and my name is Jeff Krellinston. I'm publisher of Research Money. We're delighted to have you all here. We're really pleased to be partnering with the University of Ottawa to bring you this webinar, Biomanufacturing and Canada's Pandemic Preparedness. Some technical things, if you're having any difficulties with the Zoho platform, please let us know in the chat. It's at the upper left of your corner of your screen, and Danielle will help you out. The session is being recorded, and you'll be able to access the recording on YouTube after the event in about a week. We'll get it loaded up there. If you have any questions, we're going to have Q&A later in the webinar. And if you have any questions, use the Q&A tab. You'll see there's a chat tab and a Q&A tab. Put your questions directed to the panelists in the Q&A tab, because that's what our moderator will be monitoring. If you put it in the chat, it might be missed. Now, it gives me great pleasure to welcome Julie St-Pierre, who's Vice President of Research and Innovation at the University of Ottawa. And she's also co-chair of the Canadian Pandemic Preparedness Hub. Julie will open the webinar, and I'll come back later. I'll disappear now, but I'll come back later right at the end after the Q&A to make a few announcements and close the session. So over to you, Julie.
All right, welcome everyone. Thank you, Jeffrey, for the introduction.
You're welcome.
Lorsque nous nous réunissons pour un événement comme celui-ci, nous avons coutume d'offrir une affirmation autochtone en appui aux efforts de réconciliation. Nous rendons hommage au peuple algonquin, gardien traditionnel de cette terre. We acknowledge their long-standing relationship with this territory, which remains unceded. We pay respect to all Indigenous people in this region, from all nations across Canada who call Ottawa home. Nous reconnaissons les gardiennes et gardiens des savoirs traditionnels de tous âges. Nous honorons aussi leurs dirigeantes et dirigeants d'hier, d'aujourd'hui et demain, au courage indéniable. We encourage those of you participating in other parts of Canada to take time to acknowledge Indigenous people from all nations in the regions that you reside. I'm going to say a few words about the Canadian Pandemic Preparedness Hub. So this hub is co-led by the University of Ottawa, the Ottawa Hospital Research Institute at McMaster University Global Nexus for Pandemics and Biological Threats. This hub is also one of 5 research hubs created by the Government of Canada through the Integrated Canadian Biomedical Research Fund and the Biosciences Research Infrastructure Fund. The hub is a network that brings together industry, academia, government, and healthcare institutions with contemporary research interests to enhance domestic capacity to develop and manufacture vaccines and therapeutics. So today's webinar, Biomanufacturing in Canada's Pandemic Preparedness, is a great opportunity to hear from experts in our network about the steps being taken to bridge the biomanufacturing gap, support Canadian research, and enable Canada to become internationally competitive in the translation of novel biotherapeutics. We wish to thank Research Money for the collaboration on this event. And I'll now turn it over to Stéphanie Michaud, President of CEO of BioCanRx, who is the moderator for today's webinar. Stephanie.
Thank you so much, Julie, for the introduction. And I would like to extend a very warm welcome to all of the attendees for today's webinar. As Julie has mentioned, this webinar will be about the CP2H and specifically where they fit into the landscape. So I just thought I would remind the attendees of the notes that have been provided by Jeff with respect to the Q&A. The staff at Research Money will be moderating, reviewing the chat, of course, and then posting questions if they appear there into the Q&A, but you're strongly recommended to post your questions into the Q&A in the upper left-hand corner of your screen. So this panel comes to us at a very specific time and an exciting time, specifically with respect to the policy developments in the biomanufacturing and life science ecosystem in Canada. This fall, we've had 2 momentous events occur with respect to this subject matter, one of which was the release of the expert panel report, The Time to Act is Now, very aptly named report from the expert panel, which reviewed Canada's pandemic response and identified successes and gaps and provided recommendations to improve the preparedness of the country for future pandemic and health-related crises. We also had this fall the launch of HERC, Health Emergency Readiness Canada, which is an agency which will reside within ISED, and that very much highlights the federal government's commitment to safeguarding the health of Canadians, but also has a sustained focus on growing innovation and industrial capacity in the life sciences and biomanufacturing sector. And of course, as everybody on this panel knows, the creation of the CP2H, one of 5 hubs that have been created, very much stemmed out of a recognition that this was an area of weakness for the country. And this was enunciated in the biomanufacturing and life science strategy. There was a competitive process and identification of these 5 hubs. So I would like to turn it over to this highly esteemed panel where we will be highlighting the uniqueness of the CP2H, the fact that it is very much structured as a network, bringing together extensive GMP biomanufacturing and drug development and clinical evaluation expertise and experience. And we're joined today by the leadership of some very unique nodes that compose this network. So without further ado, I will turn it on over to the panel. But first, let me introduce this esteemed panel. First, we have John Bell, who is Program Director at the Ottawa Hospital Research Institute, Scientific Director at BioCanRx, and also Co-Director of the Canadian Pandemic Preparedness Hub. Matthew Miller, Global Nexus Executive Director, Michael G. DeGroote Institute for Infectious Disease Research Associate Professor at, and it's a very long list, Matthew, I won't read it all, at McMaster University. We are joined also by Isabelle Caron, who is President and CEO of the Biologics Manufacturing Centre in Montreal. And last but not least is Dr. Scott Halperin, a professor, head of pediatric infectious diseases at the IWK Health Centre at Dalhousie University. So very warm welcome to you all. And I'd like to kick us off with situating the CP2H in the life science ecosystem currently that we have in Canada. So John and Matt, you're both the co-leads, co-scientific directors of the CP2H. Would you be able to briefly introduce yourselves and explain the respective roles that you share within the CP2H, and also provide your perspective as to why you took this approach to the design of the CP2H as a network, and what was the specific problem that you sought to address with this hub, and how do you see it benefiting the broader ecosystem? So I turn it on over to you to provide a response.
Thanks, Steph. Maybe I'll go first, Matt. There's age before beauty here, and I'll give you my sort of perspective on how this all has happened. You know, it's actually the CP2H has been built on a long history of collaboration between McMaster University and the University of Ottawa OHRI. We've been really successful in this collaboration, built on each other's strengths. What I'm going to let Matt speak about the Nexus program, which I think is a real incredible asset to Canada. McMaster has a long-term history of being world leaders really in vaccine development and antimicrobial development. And Matt's going to speak about that. What I'll briefly touch on is the other thing that both of us share at our institutes is a long history of manufacturing biotherapeutics for the treatment of a variety of diseases, including infectious diseases, but also cancers. And we at both sites have made GMP compliant material that's been used in human clinical studies around the world and really have been approved by all the regulatory agencies in Asia, Europe, United States, obviously Canada for about 15 years now. So we have a really great expertise in this particular area. And I think the other two things that are really important for CP2H is that both of our institutes are embedded within a hospital network that has access to clinical trials and people who know how to do clinical trials. And really both our centers have great track records in having impactful, having carried out impactful clinical studies. And so that really sort of embeds us in an area where we can take things right from the lab, manufacture them all the way through to test them in the clinic, which is really important. We also knew when we formed CP2H, we had a lot of thoughts about how to do this, that there have been a lot of really good investments in the past by the Canadian government in infrastructure across the country for in making academic GMP facilities. And this includes facilities in Edmonton, Saskatoon, Hamilton, and Ottawa, and recently new investments in Montreal with the CTMF and the facility that Isabel will speak about in a minute, which is a commercial scale manufacturing facility. So our whole concept was, we've got these things sort of situated around the country. Wouldn't it be much better if we all work together in a cohesive fashion so that we actually share technology, share ideas and client base, et cetera, so that we can work together. And the dream is that during a pandemic, we'd be able to work together to respond to new pandemics, to manufacture new vaccines. But in between times, we could also be able to carry out the kind of business we always do in manufacturing products for various kinds of diseases. It's actually sort of interesting that the boundaries between infectious disease and vaccine development, cancer therapeutics, stem cell, rare diseases, it's really blurring. And the same kinds of technologies and therapeutics are being developed for all those areas. And so in a way, our network has an opportunity to create medicines for Canadians, both during pandemic and non-pandemic times, to allow us to be sustainable and to really hone our skills in biomanufacturing. So Matt and I sort of sat back and thought, this is a great opportunity for us to build a hub that would, unite, make a cooperative across the country that could respond to the pandemic, both in terms of manufacturing, but also I'm going to let Matt speak now about the great expertise we have across this country in the development of novel therapeutics, especially with respect to vaccines. So Matt, do you want to just speak about next a bit?
Yeah, thanks so much, John. I think that was a really fantastic description. And certainly, I think one of the most sort of important ideologies that John and I share is being really enthusiastic about this spirit of collaboration. And what made me excited about the funding provided through the BLSS and specifically the CBRIF and BRIF programs that have funded these hubs was taking collaboration to the next level. One of my long list of titles, as Stephanie pointed out, is Canada Research Chair in Viral Pandemics. So pandemics has been a space that I've studied for a really long time. And during this most recent COVID-19 pandemic, I had the privilege of working with stakeholders in a lot of different sectors: government, industry, of course, academia, and also public health. And the CP2H hub and I think really the mandate that we were given through the BLSS was to think about collaboration, not just across academic centers, but also with all of these other really important partners in our life sciences ecosystem that are involved in and required to enable real world impact. At McMaster, Global Nexus, for which I serve as executive director, is really singularly focused on enabling real world impact through external partnerships outside of the academy. And so CP2H was beautifully aligned with that mission. As John noted, the other thing that really excites me about our mandate and the way that we've structured CP2H is indeed sort of leveraging our collective strengths rather than trying to, duplicate them. We have intentionally inbuilt redundancy, but we're really sort of leaning on the unique strengths across the Canadian ecosystem. And as academic leaders in academic institutions, we have an ability, I think, to make an impact in a variety of really important ways. One of which, of course, is through training. We think a lot about infrastructure often, because I think that's it's easy to look at big buildings and fancy pieces of equipment and sort of visualize how those are going to facilitate more readiness or support industry. But ultimately it's the people who come up with the ideas and to run these facilities and these pieces of equipment that are most important. And as academic institutions, we have a really unique opportunity to ensure that we're providing that highly skilled and excited workforce to fill those roles. And lastly, as John pointed out, although my specific area of research has really been focused on infectious disease and pandemic preparedness, I think we both realize that ultimately what makes us better prepared for pandemics is a healthy, resilient, robust life sciences ecosystem across disease indications. So the more work we're doing to support new discoveries in cancer and metabolism and rare diseases and genetic disorders, the better we will be positioned to respond in the context of a new health emergency, because those platforms are so adaptable, as John pointed out. So this really gives us an opportunity not just to prepare better for the next pandemic, but to serve as catalysts for the Canadian life sciences ecosystem in a way that I think is fundamentally different than anything that's been done before.
Great, thanks. And of course, we have the wonderful example from BioNTech, right? With respect to the mRNA vaccine that was for cancer, and then of course they pivoted, and here we are. Here we are. Thank you for that. Thank you both for these comments. I'm going to turn it on over to Dr. Halperin. And Dr. Halperin, my question is as follows, and really highlights the unique role of the facility that you have at Dalhousie. And you're the lead of Canada's only challenge unit. And I have to admit that I had to look this up as well. I specifically was and what it did. Would you be able to introduce yourself, what you do within the context of this hub and in your day-to-day, and explain what a challenge unit is and Dalhousie's role within the CP2H?
Sure, I'd be happy to. Thank you. So a challenge unit is a facility, an inpatient facility, where healthy volunteers can be exposed to a pathogen in order to better understand the pathogenesis of the organism, the immune response to that organism, and ultimately be able to test novel preventatives like vaccines or therapeutics like antivirals in a very controlled fashion, which can accelerate the understanding of the safety and effectiveness of those interventions much quicker than a field phase 3 efficacy study could do, so far fewer individuals. So within a challenge unit, one does what's called a controlled human infection model, or a CHIM study, where, and this obviously can't be done with all pathogens. There are pretty strict guidelines of the type of pathogen that can be used in these models. But one can explore the benefits of an intervention. What I'd like to do is to sort of expand on the things that Matt was talking about, and particularly with platforms and networks in relation to pandemic readiness, in that the CHIMs are a platform that one can use to accelerate the development of novel therapeutics and vaccines to a novel pathogen. Because it can be done quickly, it can be done in a controlled circumstance, and you can get answers with far few people. So what our role within the CP2H is to establish and expand on the work we're doing in our challenge unit, and also to facilitate and manufacture the pathogens that are going to be used in these CHIM studies. In order to administer an organism to a healthy individual, one needs to have that organism approved by Health Canada as if it were a drug or a therapeutic or a vaccine. and which means that it needs to be manufactured under very strict guidelines, and those are most often GMP, good manufacturing process guidelines. So our role within CP2H is to establish a small academic-based GMP facility that will be able to manufacture GMP bacteria and GMP viruses. We've already have established a CHIM model for Bordetella pertussis, the bacterial pathogen of whooping cough. And that organism that was manufactured was approved by both Health Canada and the FDA for administration. And we've now challenged over 70 people and have presented those data to the FDA. We've received funding to establish an influenza model as well, and with the assumption that influenza will be, whether it's the next or a soon-to-be pandemic pathogen, we're likely to see that, and things are getting more and more concerning with avian flu. So certainly a platform like a CHIM will be very beneficial. Just like to correct one thing you said is we're not the only challenge unit in Canada. We're the only one that has done challenge studies, but a sister unit at McGill was also established, and they were part of our clinical trial fund application, which was awarded funding to establish the influenza model. So there will be 2 functional units within the next year, one at McGill and one in Halifax.
That's great to hear. Great to hear. Thank you for that clarification. I was not aware, of course, of the McGill facility and the funding made available to them via the CTF, another biomanufacturing life science strategy program that was created. So thank you very, very much for this.
I might just add, Steph, that one of the beauties of CP2H is, for Scott's perspective, when he tries to get his GMP facility up and running, we're ready to tech transfer the quality systems, procedures, and so on, because we already have them in place. And so it's going to allow CP2H to rapidly get Scott's facility up and going, which I think is a real attribute of the collaborative approach that we take.
I couldn't agree more, John. And with respect to, that tech transfer goes both ways. Of course, Scott will be ready to prepare the CTAs that he needs in order to activate the trials, right, on these novel pathogens. So it really streamlines and, to me, very much underscored the P, right, in preparedness for future pandemics. Thank you very much, Dr. Halperin. Next, I'd like to turn it on over to Isabelle Caron, who has a very, very unique role within the CP2H as the lead of Canada's Biologics Manufacturing Centre, which very much stemmed out of the BLSS as a response to our biomanufacturing posture early on during the pandemic. Isabelle, could you please introduce yourself and the role that your organization has within the CP2H as a really critical node?
Sure. Thanks, Stephanie, for the opportunity to be in here today and discuss more with my fellow colleagues on biomanufacturing and pandemic preparedness strategy. So maybe first I can start with introducing the Biologics Manufacturing Center for the benefit of those people in the audience which might not know who we are. And then I can elaborate more on our role within CP2H. So the Biologics Manufacturing Center is a one-of-a-kind biomanufacturing facility in Canada. It's the only GMP licensed BSL-2 end-to-end domestic biomanufacturing facility, which is habilitated to produce on mammalian and insect cells expression systems, and which is operating under a full non-for-profit model. Our organization is unique in the sense that it has a public mandate, which is oriented toward 2 main objectives. The first one being creating economic and social value in Canada, and the second one being around pandemic preparedness. And how do we achieve that? We do that by providing readily available biomanufacturing capacity to support innovation in Canada and accelerate speed to market for SMEs. We also do that supporting unmet medical needs through biomanufacturing of small volumes, niche products. And lastly, by filling gaps in the ecosystem with our domestic biomanufacturing capacity to support growth, diversification, and resilience of our life science ecosystem in Canada. And as Matt mentioned earlier, ensure then that we are better prepared to future health emergencies. So the BMC aims at being a key ecosystem partner focused at fast-tracking the product to market journey and keep innovation within the nation. Now, when it comes to our role within CP2H, as you mentioned, it's very unique because we're the only GMP biomanufacturing facility sitting around the table, having the ability to produce end-to-end. So, of course, CP2H will generate innovation. And our role, as I mentioned earlier, will be to fast-track those product to market journey, as our infrastructure can support both late-stage clinical and commercial manufacturing. Our role is also to de-risk and accelerate scale-ups, being involved in the early stages of the manufacturing process development. The BMC brings the know-how of industrial scale equipments and processes. It also brings around the table an extensive knowledge of GMP considerations, which can then be built in at the design phase of the manufacturing process and eliminates all the struggles that we have when we have to scale up R&D lab scale process into industrial scale infrastructures. It's also going to ensure that commercialization of CP2H innovation stays in Canada, as we now have the infrastructure to perform the commercial manufacturing on those products. And of course, we have a mandate of pandemic preparedness, so it was a bit natural for us to get closer to CP2H, but our mandate is twofold. So of course, when the next health emergency arises, our role is to provide our domestic manufacturing capability to manufacture the needed countermeasures. But the other very important role, which happens during peacetime, is, as I mentioned previously, making sure that we will be in a better position to respond by supporting the growth and diversification of our innovation ecosystem in Canada. So it summarizes what our role in CP2H is.
Great. Thank you very much, Isabelle, for those comments. The next question is really directed to everybody that's part of this discussion panel, and it's obvious, it's very clear from the comments from all of you that the investments that have been made in the CP2H and the activities that are ongoing are going to support Canada's life science sector while working lockstep in improving our readiness posture for future pandemics. Are you able to comment, all of you, on the steps that you are taking as the CP2H to work with industry and other life science organizations in the ecosystem? What does your open for business shingle look like?
Maybe I'll start. This has been an integral component of the design of CP2H is to work with Canadian industry. One of the things I've seen over my career is a lot of great Canadian ideas just disappear south of the border. And what we've come to recognize is that biomanufacturing is one way that you can help to cement companies in Canada and anchor them here. So we've worked really hard to provide to recruit a number of industrial collaborators on this, people involved, for instance, in the development of therapeutics and vaccines, but also people involved in the analysis of those vaccines. And what I'm thinking about is Customs Biologics in Toronto, for instance, which really does a lot of things like release testing of products that are made within the CP2H group. But I think for us, sustainability is critical. The way to sustain ourselves is to have both academic clients who are doing what the sorts of stuff we do on a day-to-day basis, but also to provide service to small, medium enterprises, SMEs in Canada, because this is a huge hurdle for any new startup company. I've started a few myself. I know it's really challenging to be able to access manufacturing capabilities. Often you have to go outside the country. And we feel that we've positioned ourselves to be able to provide to SMEs the early phase material that they're going to need. And the other thing I should have mentioned better that one of the reasons we love having Isabel in this cooperative is because we're designing our facilities, our infrastructure, our technologies to be exactly scalable to her facility. And this will really help SMEs in Canada get a process they can use to make a product and have a pathway through to a commercial facility like Isabel's, and then on to larger industries if possible, because we've already in the first place thought about this and done processes, created processes and tech transfer processes that make sense for industry. So I think that's something that from the very beginning we've thought about was critical for us to be sustainable as a network.
That's a great example of integration. Thank you.
Yeah, building on John's comments, I think one of the things that I think we've done reasonably well as a sector in the university sphere is to try and increasingly support university-based spinouts. But I think if we're reflecting honestly, that has sometimes come at the expense of opening ourselves up to be better resources for outside industry partners. And, when John and I were thinking about the structure of CP2H and how to engage the Canadian biotech and biopharma sectors, that was a really important consideration, because if we, think of a product development continuum as a linear runway, which of course it's not, the ideas that start on academic benches are at one end of the runway, and the people that we want them to reach are at the other end. Businesses, by definition, industry, are way, way closer to the people on that runway than we are in the academy. And so opening ourselves up as a resource gives us much more proximal ability to enable real world impact. And the other thing that I think is really important is that although our hub was really built on a foundation of long-term strength in collaboration in the biomanufacturing space, we actually open up our partners to a continuum along that whole value chain, because ultimately the academic centers and the government centers that are part of our network can take something from the ideation stage, facilitate testing in preclinical models, including under high containment at multiple facilities, certainly including McMaster. Vito is a really important partner who has unique capabilities to study very large animal models, really unique in the world in that way, through to biomanufacturing, right into clinical trials, right, as Scott has pointed out. And to me, that's what is really needed to create the stickiness of an ecosystem that's going to help Canadian companies thrive. Because before, these pieces of the value chain or of the project development continuum have been very. So what CP2H does is really consolidate those things within a network so that we can hold the hands of our partners right through that entire development pathway and reduce a lot of the cost and time and inefficiencies that are normally associated with the sort of progressive movement from one step to the next. We want to be anticipating the next step while we're preceding it, right?
Thanks, Matt.
I think also, carrying on from that, I think CP2H was very conscious, as were the other hubs, in seeing what were the gaps and to make sure that, the gaps were filled. And that continuum is very important, that, everything that needs to be done to develop a product needs to be able to be done in Canada at reasonable scale and with timeliness, which is the important part for pandemics. At the other end, the closer to the patient or the individual public point is the the aspect of clinical trials. And with CP2H, one of its constituent partners is the Canadian Immunization Research Network, which is a CIHR Public Health Agency of Canada funded network, which is specifically set up to look at vaccines and be there for pandemic preparedness in order to rapidly test both the efficacy of vaccines, but also the safety of those vaccines and monitor them. The CERN Clinical Trials Network was involved in 5 phase 1 studies, as well as phase 2 and phase 3 studies for COVID vaccines, and also is part of the broader of evaluation, and which was also part of the CP2H network, CP2H Hub, which is the social science evaluation of the vaccines and public acceptance of vaccines, which is very important. As we've seen, developing a vaccine that's not used is no better than not developing a vaccine at all. So all of this is very much consciously integrated into CP2H and the other hubs in order to make sure that vaccines are not only can be developed in a timely fashion in Canada, but that they can be used appropriately.
On the biomanufacturing side, Stephanie, although we're collaborating closely with CP2H, we're also working closely at working on the end of the value chain to make sure that we can be sustainable in our ability to manufacture whatever comes our way. So I think the common denominator that was already mentioned by my 3 colleagues is collaboration. So the BMC is putting a lot of effort into building collaborations and working towards sustainability. And it means working on collaborations to attract more talents into our industry and develop sustainable solutions to grow the pool of qualified people we need in the ecosystem in order to be ready to pivot quickly when health emergency comes our way. It's also innovating and streamlining processes, as I think Matthew was mentioning, to fast track the technical transfer and scale up activities between sites. So we can be much more quicker than if we were looking as individual partners in silos. We're building contingency plans to ensure we can ramp up both the production cadence and the manpower when the need will be there. And we're also making a lot of efforts on the supply chain side. So diversifying our supply chains, securing supply chains, and having more domestic options in Canada is also an area of focus for us as a biomanufacturer to make sure that we can be a sustainable solution for the different players within the CP2H hub.
And maintaining that state of readiness in the case of a future event. There are questions appearing right now in the Q&A, and before I turn my attention to those, I want to ask the leadership here about the technologies that you're focusing in on as a hub. Are you agnostic as to the different types of technologies? And another question that I have for you is, what is your process for onboarding new arising technologies? So for example, we saw in the past 5 years, and I know that it wasn't an overnight success, or as one has said in the past, it was an overnight success that took 40 years. And I'm mentioning the mRNA vaccine development, of course. But with respect to horizon scanning on new technologies that could perhaps even surpass, for example, LNP mRNA technology, what is your process? And if you could comment on the types of technologies that the CP2H will be focused in on.
So maybe I'll start again. And I think when Matt speaks, I hope, Matt, you'll speak about this great vaccine that's been developed at McMaster, which I think is world leading. And it's one of the things we built our strength on is vaccines that are built on viral backbones. They make a lot of sense for a lot of reasons, and we certainly will continue to do that. But we also, as a group, make subunit based vaccines. These are innovative approaches for making a piece of a pathogen and exposing it to the immune system. as you mentioned, Steph, everybody's all intoxicated almost with mRNA technology. We definitely will embrace that, and we're beginning to get that up and running initially in Ottawa and also at Vito. So we have the capacity to make mRNA vaccines. I think they're really important. They obviously saved us in this last pandemic, but there's lots of real room for improvement. And as Matt was mentioning, one of the beauties of the machine we've created with CP2H is that we can begin to churn through new technologies and find out the ones that actually really make sense and have a good chance to be successful. So mRNA vaccines have been great, but there's recent publications showing that they don't necessarily induce a really good long-lasting immune responses we've all experienced. Whereas some of the older maybe not even that older technologies, but technologies are more established, like virus-based ones, which maybe you'll speak about it in your unique approach. So I think we're open to whatever is going to be the best thing for Canada, and I think the agility we have through our multiple facilities and institutions we work at allow us to make sure we get the best thing forward for Canadians in the event of a pandemic. But as we mentioned before, in the absence of pandemic, the best therapeutics for cancer, rare diseases, all sorts of things. That's really what our specialty is really developing stuff at the front end and moving it through in a process that makes sense and can be transferred to the industry initially. But Matt, maybe you can speak about this vaccine you made, because I'm really excited about that one.
Yeah, certainly. Yeah, thanks, John. So I agree more with John. I think the strength of the network approach that people who are not aficionados in the biomanufacturing space, I think sometimes understandably don't realize that biomanufacturing is a hugely diverse discipline and far from a one-size-fits-all approach. And so one of the real rationales and motivations for bringing all of these facilities across the country together in an organized way was to make sure that we can sort of cover the gamut of different types of biomanufacturing. Everything from cell-based therapies through to viral vectored vaccines, through to traditional inactivated vaccines, through to subunit vaccines. All of those technologies, and of course, nucleic acid vaccines are covered by partners within the network, which is really important. In our case, as John noted, we have some real long-term strength in viral vectored vaccines. In a very typically Canadian way, one of our best kept secrets is that Canada, in particular, two investigators at McMaster, Frank Graham and Jack Galdi, made the fundamental discoveries that allowed for adenoviruses to be used as vectors for vaccines. And indeed also made 293 cells, which are, I think, probably present in almost every biological laboratory around the world and are frequently used in GMP manufacturing. So that history is something that we, continue to leverage here. To the point, though, I think in speaking about the particular inhaled vaccine that our team has developed, I think it really epitomizes how what we are trying to create with CP2H can really amplify and transform the project development pathway. So we received $2 million through a CIHR rapid response at the very beginning of the pandemic, something like, I don't know, March or April of 2020. In 18 months, gone from drawing the idea for this vaccine on a through to approval for a phase 1 clinical trial. We were able to do all of that preclinical validation and run the trial for $2 million, which is probably at least 10 times less than what the industry standard would be. And the timeline is unheard of. We saw, major multinational pharmaceutical companies working on those timescales, but we had a team of like 4 to 6 people working on this under very constrained conditions because of pandemic restrictions. But the reason that could happen is because all of these pieces were united. We had the ability to design the vaccine. We had containment facilities to test it in preclinical animal models. We had teams who were experienced in generating regulatory packages. We had the ability to independently produce clinical grade GMP compliant product. And we had a skilled clinical team who could run the trial for us. When all of those pieces fit together, that runway and the ability to, do transformational things really quickly shortens significantly. So I think, obviously we're really proud of this work, but I think more importantly, it just serves as an illustration for how bringing all of these pieces, again, of that continuum and that value chain together can really transform the way that we approach developing new technologies across sort of all health indications and disciplines.
Thank you, Matt. I'm going to take a look at some of these questions that have appeared in the Q&A. And the first question is on the subject of VIDO, which is a node, correct me if I'm wrong, of the CP2H. And the question is as follows: how does VIDO fit into, and stands for Vaccine Infectious Disease Organization, fit into this network, the CP2H, and the plans for pandemic preparedness? It seems that it should be a major national investment that should be on this stage, and curious to know how the network will leverage the assets that VIDO brings. So great question, but I think the architects of the CP2H have already pondered this and included VIDO, but I'll turn it on over to all of you to speak to that and the role of VIDO within the CP2H.
I can take an initial stab.
Go ahead, Matt. Yeah.
VIDO is a super important partner because indeed they have been the focal point of major national investments, and they have some really unique capabilities. In particular, their ability to contain large animals is extraordinarily important. VIDO, prior to the pandemic, also has a very, very long history in making commercial vaccines for veterinary health applications. And I think what we all learned, all of us who are not, deep into the field already during this most recent pandemic, and is worth re-emphasizing in the context of what's happening right now in the news with avian influenza, is that preventing pandemics is a very multidisciplinary endeavor that requires this so-called One Health approach, right? If we want to prevent pandemics from happening, the best way to do that is to protect ourselves at the human-animal interface, because pandemics happen when new diseases spill over from animals. VIDO is really a leader in One Health space, and doing things that promote animal health have the added benefit of promoting human health. On the manufacturing side, VIDO also has capabilities that are unique relative to other places in our network. They can produce inactivated vaccines, again, under containment. So, an inactivated, SARS-CoV-2 vaccine, for example, and they're able to produce recombinant vaccines as well, which is an inbuilt redundancy that can also be accomplished by other nodes within our network. But they're a really critical partner and have some very, very unique infrastructure and expertise, which is a perfect fit within the national landscape, I think.
And if I can add to that, Matthew, we're not just talking about pandemic preparedness, we're talking about potential health emergencies. And VIDO, with their experience in producing veterinary vaccines, can be a major key player in protecting our food chain and all the economical part associated to exports that Canada is doing in the food world. So I think they are instrumental as well, because the next pandemic could touch the animal kingdom that we are using as food, and it will then become a health crisis for us as humans.
And the participation of VIDO in this consortium cooperative is based on long-standing collaborations between VIDO and the individual members of the nodes. In Halifax, we've had over 20 years of very close collaborative. The COVID vaccine that they developed was phase 1 study was done in Halifax by the Clinical Trials Network of CERN. So their integration is into the system is complete.
Thank you, Scott. A recent question that has popped into the Q&A is the following. In the case of pandemic conditions, how do the networks in Canada collaborate internationally in both detection, vaccine development, trials, and treatment? So how does the machine gear up, and undoubtedly would require interaction with HERC. But would you be able to comment on this?
Yeah, I think it's a great question because, of course, the other thing that we were all reminded of during this pandemic is that health emergencies are global problems. They're not local problems. And although on its face, our mandate is to ensure, coordination and domestic capacity within the country, that can't happen without integration into larger global networks. In many ways, I am hopeful that HERC will be a really important machine through which some of that happens. Our network has already met via HERC with like-minded agencies and networks in the US. Many of us, of course, are also deeply integrated into global infectious disease emergency ready networks in our own spaces. So I think the benefit of having hubs like CP2H is that the hub leverages the connections of all of these individual members, in addition to the more formal communication and collaboration structures that are put in place to ensure that our responses are coordinated globally and not just within the borders of Canada.
Yeah, I mean, the scientific community is global, as Matt pointed out. We are integrated into the global network already during our day jobs, but we also interact, as Matt mentioned. We've had some discussions with the U.S., the BARDA, and those sorts of organizations already, and we'll continue to do that. But for instance, BioCanRx, as you'll know, Steph, has reached out to the UK to discuss the manufacturing strategies for, in this case, for cancer immunotherapeutics. But we have these networks already functioning across Canada, US, Europe, and Asia. And so it will be, although our main thinking is we have to help Canadians in a pandemic because everyone has to do their bit, we will be right at the forefront, understand the technology that everyone has access to, and creating and developing and contributing to the rest of the world as well, because that's the way the world is now. It's no longer, I think Isabel used silo. We don't want to do silos. It's true. We just don't silo anymore. We now are a big community and we interact at all times. We're competitive, but we want to also work together at the same time.
I think the CP2H hubs can bring some of the answers to that question, but I think there's a very important component on the HERC side. And although I think both the industry and academia was very happy of the announcements of the creation of HERC, there's still a lot of work to do to get HERC organized with their ways of working, governance, funding programs. So I think another role that the CP2H hubs has is advocating for what's missing in terms of policies, what's missing in terms of flexibility in some funding programs or sustainability in some funding programs in order to facilitate putting together all the puzzle pieces that we need to make sure that we're better prepared to manage the next crisis.
I couldn't agree more. As the people on the ground, you'll have a unique view into what is working and what is not, and where the gaps are. And on that subject, with respect to the gaps, there's a question here with respect to, aligned to what you've just said, Isabelle, which is the following, which is a question about the model for supporting Canadian startups and SMEs, whether or not the CP2H would act as a reference customer, an investor, a product development partner, other. How do you see that working, and perhaps what could HERC's role be in this? Because I think that will be a really important part of that puzzle.
Yeah, it's a great question. It's the right question, actually, and I think what we don't want to do is we don't want to duplicate what is already working out there, because that's not our role. Is to work with and to facilitate. And some of those things we can bring value to, as Matt was mentioning. The great level 3 facility they have at Master allows preclinical studies that could not be done at your average vendor out in the public. And so that's a great asset that we can bring to SMEs, for example. We all have experience in development of preclinical models in a variety of diseases. That's something that we do. But at the same time, we don't want to repeat what's being done really well in the private sector. I mentioned earlier Customs Biologics as an example. They are really great at assay development, executing assays at a GMP level for release testing. And that's something that we probably don't really want to do, but we want to work with them to have them test our material as it goes forward. So I think it's going to be a matter of really integrating together what we do and what the private sector does. And there may be gaps there that we need to address, and we're happy to try to do that. But I think we can bring to the table, through our collaborative approach, different kinds of facilities and expertise and so on, and personnel to begin to address these particular issues, because they're critical. And we've all been involved in filing regulatory documents to get trials approved, so we understand what's required there. And we're very open to and happy to collaborate with industry in this respect.
Yeah, I think the work that we're aiming at doing with CPHI of developing innovation which has the potential to be commercialized, and fostering a growing, resilient, and diverse ecosystem which is going to create stickiness, is going to be much more attractive to private investor and international investment. So the whole idea behind creating that solid pipeline of innovation which is having the potential to really become a commercial product is going to lead to more private investments, to my opinion. We cannot just rely on the public funds and just always ask for more and more. What we're aiming at is creating the environment which will be attractive to more and more investment from different stakeholders.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, to John's point earlier, and maybe hearkening back to my opening remarks, we really want to leverage the strengths of, the existing players within the sector. And so I think where we really shine, like if I had to hedge on something particular, is in the product development component. I think that that's where sort of expertise and infrastructure all kind of merge in a way that academia is best suited to support. A GLP tox study, for example, I would argue in most cases is better done with a CRO in most instances, because CROs can do that really efficiently. In many ways, it's algorithmic, right? And they can do it in a way that's going to support a regulatory filing. We're not looking at duplicating those kinds of services. We're looking to fill the gaps, right? And so I think that's one place where we really shine. And again, the other thing that the network offers is the ability to hand people off into these other partners, right? Whether that's a clinical trial, whether that's preclinical testing, whether that's GMP manufacturing, from everything from small scale to commercial scale.
Thank you, Matt. So we have additional questions that have popped up in the Q&A, and one is very specific with respect to the set of definitions that are used by the CP2H. And the question is how the CP2H defines preparedness or readiness, to what level of development level, should a lead vaccine candidate, for example, be brought stop at preclinical, GLP tox, or phase 1?
Well, with respect to the second part, we're open to all of those things. I think that's where we have expertise, and as Matt was just mentioned, that's our sweet spot, is actually phase 1, phase 2. But we also, through this partnership with Isabel, have the ability to take it to the next level. So I think if an SME comes to us, or an academic comes to us with a vaccine candidate, even in the very earliest stages, we can potentially help them and maneuver that all the way through the system, right to the very end, even to commercialization. So I think we're open to new ideas and new technologies. So, come, we're happy to do it.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of that, the response to that question is really at a policy level. And as you're aware, governments are making different policies on that, and where Canada is going to slot there, it really depends. I mean, there are, for example, avian influenza, with the H5N1, there are pre-pandemic vaccines that are being produced and in the US have been approved and are being stockpiled. Canada hasn't decided whether or not to do that yet. So those are governmental decisions because stockpiling is a government issue. But I think, as John said, CP2H is there to facilitate whatever Canada decides in order to, whether it be preclinical work or through phase 1 studies, because all those vaccines have to be tested for at least phase 1 before they're stockpiled.
Yeah, and to sort of tie an end around that really important point that Dr. Halpern just made, I think the answer in terms of like where for example, a lead vaccine candidate should be brought is that it really depends. It's a very hard question. So having phase 1 safety data for platforms can be very helpful because it can make that platform easier to adapt to subsequent studies. The complexity, in my view, in the infectious disease space is that for many pathogens at phase 1, what we do, right, is our primary focus for vaccine development, really any phase 1 study, is safety. But we always, or almost always at least, measure immunogenicity, right? Is the vaccine inducing the immune response we expect? In many, many cases, though, we don't necessarily know a priori what magnitude or qualities of an immune response are going to be protective. And I want to take this point to plug Scott's facility, because this is really where human challenge models bring a huge amount of value. Because unlike most any other disease, if you want to do efficacy testing for a vaccine, you have to enroll orders of magnitude more people than will be defined as cases, right? If we look back to the pivotal phase 3 studies done for the COVID vaccines, right? They're enrolling 20, 30, 40,000 individuals just to get hundreds of total cases in order to be able to make statistically robust conclusions about how well the vaccine works. That's extraordinarily expensive and time consuming and logistically challenging. And a vaccine that induces a good immune response that you might be able to phase 1 doesn't necessarily mean that immune response will be protective. So having a network that includes the capability of doing efficacy studies in these very controlled settings is a really important way to de-risk these technologies and get early data for very modest investment that we can't possibly get in this particular infectious disease space and in other ways, at least not readily.
Thank you, Matt. I have a question. I do want to get to another question in the chat, but I will ask this related question. So, of course, we've been speaking about the capabilities of the CP2H, and you've very well described, what a potential pathway could look from clinical all the way to clinical trials. And then also, a potential to access the BMC and, tech transfer for commercial product development and production. How does the CP2H relate to the other hubs? So there are 4 other hubs that have been created, and I know that the hubs, meet with each other, but with respect to, we have a good understanding of where the CP2H is, but would you be able to take a step back and describe to us what the constellation of the 5 hubs look like and how they work with each other or not? Or if you could speak to that.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I think one of the things that has been reassuring in this process is that after the hubs were announced, there was a very organic grassroots effort to develop a system through which the hubs could coordinate their activities. For better or worse, that was not a sort of top-down structure or mandate, meaning, funders, I said, did not sort of have that structure in place beforehand. But in many ways, I think that was positive because it allowed us to have sort of open and evolving discussions around the best ways for us to collaborate. The hubs across the country also interconnect because many of us have shared partners or are involved in multiple hubs. So that's one really important way that I think communication and coordination is facilitated. We also have inbuilt redundancies, but also unique strengths. So certainly our hub, our unique strength is in GMP biomanufacturing without question. HI3, the hub that's hosted by University of Toronto, is particularly strong, for example, in health intelligence, epidemiology, built largely off the excellence at Dalalana and the hospital network. So that's not to say that any of these hubs are exclusively focused in those areas, but I think that every hub sort of brings a unique core strength that allows us to make sure that we have coverage over the preparedness space, both graphically, but also from an expertise perspective. And I suspect that as HERC continues to evolve, that there will be increasing mechanisms at the level of government to support the coordination and collaboration of activity across these hubs.
Thank you, Matt.
There's a great example of how I see us working together. So, for instance, the BC Hub was awarded funds to build a GMP facility, and that's going to take some time. These facilities don't come up overnight; they take years to get ready and then to commission them and get them going. And we see our role as really assisting in that, providing technology to them, quality systems, whatever it is they need to get their facility up and going. And in the meantime, because we have functional GMP manufacturing facilities already, we can provide that to the other hubs. Anyone who comes from a different hub who has a novel therapeutic or vaccine, we're prepared to manufacture them. So I think even though they sort of popped up individually, there is a lot of willingness to share between all of us things that we can do together. And as Matt mentioned, we've already gotten together many times to say, let's make the most of what we do and let's work together in some way to make this better for all of Canada.
Thank you, John.
I believe that there's a very nice interaction between the hubs, but I'd like to emphasize the fact that the hubs are also trying to stay connected with the industry. Because I'm on both sides of the fence, I see that the hubs are connecting with the industry. I'm co-chairing the Life Science Strategy Council, which is interacting with the hubs and making sure that we develop progressively the processes that are needed to make sure that the industry provides the support that the hubs needs and vice versa, and that we're not using the funds to duplicate efforts and infrastructures that are already existing in the industry, but that we indeed use them to support the hubs. So it's still in the early stages, trying to figure out how to put all the pieces together and make it work. Takes time, represent the challenges, but there are a lot of efforts, not only between the hubs to stay connected, but from the umbrella hub structure to connect with the industry.
Thank you, Isabel. There are quite a few questions with respect to, and this is why I want to get a better overview of what the individual hubs were doing, and I thank you for that. And it's specifically with respect to the development of small molecules. And the individual that has set for this question states that they still see gaps in Canada in the area of preclinical development in areas such as pharmacokinetics, pharmacodynamics modeling for human dose regimen safety studies, and this specifically in the area of small molecule therapeutics. I don't think that the CP2H would be addressing the gaps in terms of small molecule development, but would you be able to comment on this, or would this really fall under the purview of another hub?
I think the answer is kind of both, to be honest. So there are other hubs that have some real strengths in that area. The Prairie Hub in particular has a strong group there who has a lot of history in developing small molecule antiviral therapeutics in particular. Although CP2H wasn't funded in that space, it was a major priority area for us as we were developing the hub. And certainly many of our respective institutions, McMaster included, have some really, really world-leading strengths in these areas. In McMaster's case, it mostly centered on development of novel antimicrobials, which I know was a question that in the chat. And so, although at the moment, the projects that were funded through our hub aren't explicitly focused on small molecule development, the reality, of course, is that we're trying to leverage the resources and infrastructure that the network brings together to support that kind of work well, which, again, also leverages, sort of all of our ancillary support capabilities, including a medicinal chemistry unit we have here. There are high throughput drug screening facilities, both at McMaster and at Ottawa, who are engaged and collaborated in the process of making CP2H happen. So it's an area that we are really interested in. We are funding and supporting it through other mechanisms now, but I think are hopeful that it could be a place that we could go into more formally as the network develops and moves forward.
Thank you, Matt. There's a question or a few questions with respect to avian influenza specifically, which of course is in the news, and some headlines very recently of a case in Canada where the leap seems to have occurred between infection in an animal and going towards a human. Do you have any comments with respect to this, and how would the CP2H respond to this type of threat?
Well, I think, Matt, you should talk to this. Matt is Canada's expert, I would say, in this particular space.
Yeah, so in the context of avian flu, flu was my baby before COVID happened, and the lens had to expand a little bit. But I think the network, again, I think the strength of the network is in leveraging the respective strengths of all of our partners. So in addition to sort of the biomedical work that our team does, both independently with some really exciting industry partners through formalized collaboration, we get everything from prophylactic interventions to vaccines to new diagnostic assays. But maybe even more importantly, and I think this was a point that Dr. Halperin made earlier, one of the areas where our experts are very frequently engaged is in helping decision makers. So I sit on the National Advisory Committee on Immunizations, High Avian Flu Working Group, Polio Immunization Advisory Committee, and on an expert panel with the Health Agency of Canada. And so I think that this is maybe one of the under-recognized areas where the members of our hub are able to leverage their, specific expertise to help identify gaps and formulate policy as well, because at the end of the day, especially as it pertains to emergency preparedness, in my view, some of the most important gaps are policy gaps. And I'll give you maybe some examples. In the context of avian flu, one of the things that we're really struggling with is if and when to institute a pre-pandemic vaccination program. That in itself is fundamentally a policy question. There are approved avian influenza in Canada, Dr. Halperin indicated earlier. We know how to administer those vaccines, but the question is sort of like, how would we implement that? What would be trigger points to decide when we implement that and for whom? In addition, I think the thing that was a struggle for many people in the public pandemic was lack of clarity around how non-pharmaceutical public health measures are implemented. So I think to many people in the public, it seems sort of random when decisions were made about what types of public health containment measures were put in place. So limitations on capacity, social circle limitations, were parks and golf courses opened or closed. And I think one of the things that we can really help support, in addition to, biomedical countermeasures, diagnostics, et cetera, is in helping fill some of these policy gaps. And one of the earlier panelists also noted that this was a really important component of the expertise that we used to build this network initially. People who are experts in behavior and misinformation and government policy and evidence synthesis. These are super important parts of coordinated and effective pandemic response that a lot of work still in Canada and internationally. CP2H, to answer the question more directly, has obviously responded really rapidly to this emerging situation. We, for example, have used the inhaled COVID vaccine platform to develop a new candidate specific for avian influenza. We've pulled in members of our team who are experts in diagnostics to build out new diagnostics. We also have folks in the work who are trying to run to MPOX. So there's a lot of sort of diversity happening, in the way that the network is doing that really depends on what the end application and sort of where along the sort of product development or implementation continuum those individuals are working.
Thank you, Matt. So we have a few. We have additional questions, of course, in the Q&A with respect to funding and long-term, medium to long-term funding for these types of initiatives. So if memory serves, the amount of funding that has been invested, certainly in the BRIF initiative, was a little bit over $500 million. And so the first question that I'd like to obtain this panel's comments on is it speaks to the availability of government funding to keep this sustained in the long term. And Isabel, I know that you had touched on this and the need to bring in, build up this ecosystem to bring in additional investment. But with respect to the funding that's going to be required, what would that look like in order to get to the next stage where we really have this steady state ecosystem? How, what are the next investments that need to be made, government? And then this other question here is with respect to the fact that in Canada, we do have limited availability of funding for these types of facilities. And is there a risk of duplication? And should all of government try to coordinate what is funding in terms of capital infrastructure? So the first question is about, in the medium to long term, what do you see as needed investments in order to achieve, hopefully what will sustainability, the steady state, where we're able to attract those private sector investments? And then the second question is with respect to the replication in the investments that have been made right now. And the question, should all levels of government try to coordinate what is funded in terms of capital infrastructure? Because we did have in the panel report comments on duplication of activities, though I think that in the context of the CBRF and the BRIF, this in the decision making, this has been taken into account. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on that, and happy to repeat if necessary.
Maybe I can jump in first, because I think a lot of this relates to HERC. I think HERC was critically needed to ensure a national coordination of the overall effort and funding. So to me, the first critical step in order to be able to work in coordination and not duplicate is to understand the current state. So it would be a logical step for HERC to map what do we have as capabilities in Canada in the different important areas of focus, so we can then identify gaps or opportunities where we should invest more funds and more efforts to be better ready to react to a health emergency. And that means having a stronger life science ecosystem and more resilient life science ecosystem. So for me, it's a logical first step. Understand where you are, understand what your needs are. So what are the threats that are coming to us? Which one is the most likely to happen? And what would be the priorities from a health perspective for investing efforts, both on the innovation side, infrastructure side, talent side? So it's all at the HERC level, to my belief, to establish that. And then when it comes to filling the gaps or creating or materializing the opportunity, then that's where the hubs and the industry players and other institutions in the life science ecosystem will jump in and will raise their hand and say, oh yeah, we can contribute on this specific need and objective that we have to fill a gap.
Yeah, I agree completely with Isabelle. And I think maybe just to add 2 concise points. One, I think it's really going to be important for hubs to clearly communicate, articulate to government, as well as, citizens in Canada, that this is a priority for them. And I think the best way we can do that is to emphasize again that we're not just focused on pandemic preparedness, which, frankly, is not a vogue topic for many people in the public right now, that we're focused on enhancing Canadian health, generally speaking, across all disease indications, and that these investments will provide Canadians with access to new opportunities to treat cancer, to treat metabolic disease, to treat genetic disease. And in doing that, we will become prepared very organically. The second thing, I think, so that I think helps the sustainability argument, because it is compelling. I think it's a more compelling argument to say that, hey, we're going to be contributing to really practical solutions that everyone needs during, what people call peacetime, and that will help more prepared when an emergency happens. The second point that I think is worth stressing, and this is something that a colleague of Isabelle and myself brought up at a panel that we happened to both be on yesterday, is that I think we should be much more ambitious in Canada about serving as a resource for the global community. We have a lot of geopolitical and demographic strengths that make Canada a very attractive place to do business and do scientific development work and clinical development work. And so rather than sort of thinking small, which, you know, as polite Canadians, I think we're prone to doing, we also need to be thinking about how, you know, these unique resources and investments set us up to be a resource for other places in the world where the infrastructure is not in place. And that helps Canadians by extension also, because it brings that business and those new technologies and expertise into Canada in ways that we couldn't possibly do if we're just sort of myopically focused on our own borders. So I think, you know, thinking deeply about those two issues will be really important for our sustainability in the long term.
Well said, and directly addresses a question that was in the chat earlier on with respect to plans for working with developing countries to get their GMP vaccine production capabilities up and running, and the impact that, you know, an effort such as this one at the CP2H, which is so focused on harmonization of different GMP facilities and rapidly progressing assets towards the clinic, is perfectly structured to do. Any additional comments from the panel before we bring it to a close? And so we're at time right now. Any final comments from the panel?
I would just like to briefly echo what Isabel and Matt said, that, you know, I think HERC is great, because HERC is a recognition by the government that they need to keep doing this and keep it going. It's been a great investment initially. We need to carry this on. Investment in research and development drives our economy. I think that's something people don't recognize, how critical that is to our economy. So I think having more investment, and I really believe HERC is the first time I've seen a real visionary approach to getting continued support for these kinds of activities, which are critical to Canadians' health.
Well, thank you so much for these closing comments, and thank you very much for your time and excellent discussion. And in case you haven't had a chance because you were too busy speaking, there were lots of expressions of thanks in the chat, in addition to comments on the excellence of the panel. So thank you very much, and I will turn it back over to Mr. Jeff Crenliston.
Thanks, Stephanie. And thank you, John and Matt and Isabel and Scott, for such a stimulating discussion. I learned a lot, and thanks to your work, we'll be better prepared for the next pandemic. And also, as Matt emphasized, Canadians' health will improve over the long term. So, and thanks also to Stephanie. I mean, you're an amazing moderator. You really ran the ship tightly and well, and thanks for that. It was great. Tomorrow, you're all invited to another webinar, Canada's Path to the 4 Trillion Global Bioeconomy. We're partnering with Natural Products Canada. They have a unique model for supporting startups in the natural products sector. And we'll be hearing from some of the companies that they're helping to build a strong national products sector in Canada. There's a link in the chat to registration to that. And you're also invited to register for the 24th Annual Research Money Conference, which will be in Ottawa next May. Super early bird pricing ends at the end of this month, so take advantage of it and register before the end of the month, and the link is in the chat. So with that, I'd like to thank everyone for attending. It was great, and everyone have a great day.